G'day, welcome back. And in this module, I want to talk about styling the charts and tables that you might have in your dashboard. Now, we covered some of this in the module on chart options, but just to keep it separate and in its own little place, let's talk about the main, again, I'm just going to cover the main types of chart. I'm not going to cover absolutely everything, and the various styling options that you have for these. So in the time series, you can actually turn that into a bar chart if you really want. Generally speaking, if you're doing a time series, because it's over time, you're probably going to show that line. You can change the thickness and the colors of the lines, all pretty standard, pretty easy to do. You can't smooth it, that I've seen, so you can't sort of create that nicer looking line. You can stick a trend line through it if you really want to get funky, but you're generally probably not going to use that, and obviously you can style that line. You may or may not need to do that. Cumulative, well, cumulative charts always go up and to the right. They can make you look good, but they're generally not very useful, and most people that are smart with data will say, don't show me a cum chart, show me this thing over time, because it's much more useful. Do I want to put the little dots on there? You don't have a huge amount of control about what they look like, and you can put the label points on that. I generally don't do that. I'll generally put, so if I go in and change this, for instance, from clicks to conversions, I'll generally do something like that, where I'll put that in conjunction with the chart that I'm showing. So I'm going to keep my y-axis on so that you can see, get some context, this rough scale. I can remove that if I want to in style somewhere over here. If I get rid of that, I can essentially create a spark line, but I think having some context there, what I'd love to be able to do is to choose whether I show just X or Y, but not both. You can't do that at this point. You can label them differently in here, so you can see I can add the name conversions over there, and if I'm going to add conversions, then I can get rid of my legend. Legend is here. I can choose whether that's at the bottom of the side or none. So if I label that, I can get rid of the legend, which gives me a little bit more room for my chart. But I can't remove the date from here. All I can do is I can turn everything off, or both of them. Oh, hello. Where are we? Or both back on. So generally you're going to leave, I think you're probably going to leave both back on. Now you can, inside of here, move things around. So if you've got, if you want to label these different, if you've got campaigns, say, down this column, you can make more room for that. So I'm a big fan of sort of using all of the available space so that the data has more room to breathe. But you can do minor things like that. You can't control everything, but hey, it's pretty powerful. Other ones in here, you can do all sorts of styling around the grid. So just to sort of show you that, just I'll put a horrible color on there so it stands out. You can change colors of that. I don't really see how you're why you'd want to need to do that most of the time. And then, background colors, yuck, and borders and so on. You can change colors of that, and opacity and funky things like that. Let me push all of that to the background. Yeah, again, probably not much point that you're going to do that. Get on with it, Mike. Right, that's the style for the time series. In here, really, you haven't got huge amounts of, you don't need much. The main thing to look at here is you put this tick in the box. Compact numbers, change decimal points, because a lot of the times you'll want to tidy this up. Like if you've got a cost here of 58,682.13, you probably don't need to be talking about cents when you're talking tens of thousands of dollars. So it'll always be set to auto by default. I'll often set that to 0 for certain types of scorecards. They added this recently, so you can put in a show 0 or show no data when there is something missing. That can be useful. Hopefully you don't need to use that very often. But really that's the main thing, and whether or not you get rid of the name. So you can choose to get rid of the name and just put the number there, because sometimes you may want to have a different heading there, or use a text box to explain this a little better. and then in here, hide the metric name, and then stick those two things together. So yeah, you can get a bit of control that way. You don't always have to use the name that it comes with out of the box, if that makes sense, in there. And obviously you can change the fonts and so on in there. I haven't done this a lot on my charts to date. I've pretty much left everything as the standard font. Moving on, bar charts. Let me go back and take that dimension off that we added during the last module. Styling of these, probably the main one I like in here is just being able to well, that one. If I'm, again, showing campaigns like we were just talking about, I can make room for the campaign name and put those down the page. I think that generally is easier to read than that, depending obviously on what the label on the thing is. All the things that we had before, whether or not we show the axes, whether we show the axes title, and styling around borders and so on, and the legend, same as before. Do I want to show conversions there, or do I want to stick it on the axis title in there? That's really the main things. Why can I not change the colors of the bars? I don't know. I had that on my list of things to do down here, and I think I've managed to somehow stuff it up. So there you go. That's what happens when you record live. There wasn't. Oh, there we go. Now it's going back to blue. So I've clearly managed to totally confuse this thing. Usually you have an option in here of show multiple color, or show one color and multiple colors, and you tick the box and they all change to pretty colors. I've clearly broken that one, so I'm just going to leave that well alone and moved on to stack bars. Sorry about that. Right, in here we go. Look, a single color, multiple colors. The same thing should happen on the other one. Talked a little bit about this when we talked about the chart type before. There are times where 100% stacking makes sense. It obviously doesn't when my metric is impressions. If my metric were impression share, then it would make a lot more sense to show that. But obviously think about the data you're presenting. I mentioned when we were going through the chart type that the legend on here, I don't get a whole lot of control about the order of that, which is somewhat annoying. I can go into data and I'm sorting by impressions here. Let's see what happens if sorting by campaign isn't going to help me, so I can't choose the order of my legend, which is minorly annoying. Don't know why Google's picked that particular order. Obviously, based on AdWords, you'd want Google top, Google other, search partner top, search partner other, and then Google display. And I could filter that if I wanted to. I could go into data and create a filter down here for the slots that I wanted to show up. If I wanted to hide Google Display Network, for instance, from this, I could go and create a filter. We'll talk about that in the filter module. Essentially, changing colors, where you put the legend, and XY axis and grids and so on. The thing I want to show you on Pi is that you can turn this into a donut. That's really the main bit of styling that you're going to do in here. You get to choose a number of slices. So if I set this at 3, I'm going to get blue here, red here, and then everything else, the other 3, are going to get turned into other. So lump all others together. So you can use that to simplify stuff. Generally the default's going to be set to 10. You're probably going to use that. So this is how you make the donut, by sliding this in here. And so that can just create a more modern looking pie chart, and you can do obviously choose how you want that set based on your preference. Other than that, it's pretty normal. Labels, you're probably going to stick with percentage. Having the label, which is the same as the legend, that may make sense because maybe people just need to visualize that percentage. It's mostly blue, a chunk of red, and a little bit of everything else. In which case, you could put that label there and then get rid of the legend, like so. Or you may want to put the value on there, but that doesn't work particularly well when it's percentage, I've found. So I'll go back to percent, much better. And then the last one that we need to think about is the table. Again, you're going to use this a lot. So you can have all of these different metrics. What I'd like to do, which I know is really not necessary, but I'm picky like this in the styling, is to tidy up some of these numbers. This isn't a great example because all of these numbers are actually coming through okay, apart from that little 0%, which for consistency's sake should be 0.00 compared to the other things there. Let's add something like position. See if we can break this a little. So position, there we go. So it looks, to me that just looks messy. And so if we go back into styling, what we have to do is figure out which column it is. Now, your dimension is not a numbered column. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Average position is 7, which is obviously going to be the last one. Yes, I want it as a number, but I don't want that decimal precision. I want to set, because it's average position, I want to set it to 1 decimal place. And so you'll find times where you want to override what's there. Conversion rate here must be column 5. So I actually want conversion rate to be 2 decimal places, and that fixes that 0.0. Most of the time, you'll find out of the box, it comes out just fine. You don't have impressions, .00, because that is an integer. But for cost and so on, I think I've mentioned this somewhere else, but if I quickly throw a scorecard in here for, let's change this to cost. If you've got a big number, I think having decimals on the end of that looks a little bit silly. So I do like to style that, change that decimal to 0 when I'm talking big numbers, but obviously use it where it's sensible to use it. Back to tables, which is what we were talking about. You can choose to turn row numbers on and off over there, and then this pages you can turn on and off. I generally leave that on, but just make sure that this is fairly close to the end of the data. If you put this in here because you're not sure how many rows there are going to be on a table, this can get a little bit confusing to the user. It almost looks like I'm supposed to go to the next page of my report by clicking on this thing, rather than that being visually tied to the table. So just be aware of that you want to think about the number of rows here. And if you think this is usually 5 rows but might be more, well then change the rows per page to 5. Now, you haven't got huge options in here, 5, 10, 20 and so on, but generally that's going to be enough. If you think a lot of the time it's going to need 10 rows, leave enough for 10, set it to 10 rows as a max, but then just make sure that those sort of roughly fit, if you know what I mean. Styling wise, really not a whole heap to be thinking about in here. I haven't messed with these. I tend to leave stuff as it is out of the box. I haven't gone in and set zebra stripes or whatever they're meant to be called. Could, but I generally don't do that. I figure out of the box generally looks better than me messing with it. The one thing I will often do is table labels. I'll change this from the default of 12 to 14 just to make my data that little bit easier to read. Occasionally I'll put it on 18 or 24 as well, just to really make that stand out, make things easier. And then here we go, I made a list and I'm not following it. Wrap header, you can see when we've added average position, if I don't give it enough room, stuff is going to get truncated. Wrap text under here is going to give me more readable headers. That's almost always a good thing to tick. Even if you don't need it, it's just if you then go and add other columns later on, it'll make sure that your table stays readable. So that's probably a good tip in there. The main thing in here is having that slight control over all of my numbers. How do I want them displayed? And what's the decimal precision? So let's take clicks here, a couple of other options under here. Heat map, a little bit like Excel, conditional formatting. So I can sort of have those highest things jump out a little more obviously. I've never used bar pub. There you go. So you can stick a little bar chart in there instead of the number. Never used that. I think a lot of people would get confused if you showed them that as their thing. I need to now go back in and change that to a number. Easy. All right, everything's the same. Background border and so on as before. So very, very, very easy to style, and you don't need to do any of this. Out of the box, it works very well. Everything looks decent enough. You really don't need to mess with it too much unless you have a particular need to. I'll see you in the next module. Bye for now.